Okay, well, welcome back to another week of the workshop in the history of material texts. I'm Zach Lesser, professor in English, and I co-organized the seminar with Jerry Singerman, who's the senior humanities editor at the Penn Press.
Hello, everyone.
And John Pollack, who's a curator in the Kislak Center.
Welcome, everybody.
And Philip Mogan, who's the Brisbane Schoenberg Fellow in the History of Material Texts and helps us to keep everything running.
Hi, everyone.
And I see Peter, who is founding director of the seminar. Peter, do you want to say hi?
Hi.
So we're coming to the end of our Zoom year, hopefully our one and only year like this. It's been disruptive and hard, but also exciting and expanding. And I'm always amazed by how many people log on to our sessions from all over. So thank you for coming, whether you've come once or twice, or whether you've come every week. And thank you for your thoughtful participation in the workshop this year. Next week, we'll close out the year as usual with Roger Chartier, who will be staying up heroically late in Paris to join us. We do expect, along with Penn more broadly, to be back in person in the fall. That's our current expectation. I think it's the language the administrators are using. And we're going to think hard over the summer about how we might preserve some of the excitement of our Zoom meetings and all that they enabled, while returning to the kind of scholarly engagement that being in the same room together allows. Plus, we hopefully will be returning to our post-seminar Peking duck. But regardless of how we strike that balance, we plan to continue our new semesterly roadshow, which we created during the pandemic. Each one has a theme, and we invite 4 speakers to give lightning round talks on a material, text, or object that is important to them. We're grateful to Bethany Wiggin, director of the Penn Program in Environmental Humanities, for suggesting this spring's theme, environmental material texts. And I'm really pleased to introduce our speakers, who are all experts in different aspects of this field. I think it'll be a really interesting combination of talks. So I'm going to introduce all 4 speakers, and then they will give all of their talks, and then we will open it up for Q&A as usual. Stephanie Foote is my old friend and colleague from University of Illinois days. She's now the Jackson and Nichols Professor of English at West Virginia University. She's the author of Regional Fictions, Culture and Identity in 19th Century American Literature from 2001, The Parvenu's Plot, Gender, Culture, and Class in the Age of Realism, 2014, and she edited 2 lesbian pulp classics by Anne Aldrich, We Walk Alone and We Too Must Love, both books that I highly recommend. Her work in the field of environmental humanities includes the edited collection Histories of the Dust Heap, Waste, Material Cultures, Social Justice, the journal Resilience that she founded and edits, and her forthcoming book, The Art of Things. Matt Kirschenbaum is professor of English and Digital Studies at the University of Maryland, where he also created and co-directs the Book Lab. His first book, Mechanisms, 2008, was a pioneering work in digital bibliography. He also wrote Track Changes, A Literary History of Word Processing, 2016, and the forthcoming Bitstreams, The Future of Digital Literary Heritage, which began as the Rosenbach Lectures in 2016. Iris Montero is visiting assistant professor of Hispanic Studies and Science and Technology Studies at Brown. She received her PhD in History and Philosophy of Science from Cambridge in 2016, and her dissertation received an honorable mention for the Prize for Young Scholars for the years 2012 through 2016, given by the International Union of the History and Philosophy of Science. She's finishing a book with the wonderful title, What the Hummingbird Knows, which explores how native Mexican and European intellectuals co-produced knowledge in the field of early modern natural history. And J.T. Roane is assistant professor of African and African American Studies in the School of Social Transformation at Arizona State University. He received his PhD in history from Columbia University in 2016. He serves as the PI for the Black Ecologies initiative at ASU's Institute for Humanities Research. He is a 2020-21 NEH Mellon Foundation Research Fellow at the Schomburg Center, where he's working on a book entitled Dark Agoras, Insurgent Black Social Life and the Politics of Place in Philadelphia. So please join me in welcoming them all to the seminar. And we will begin with Stephanie.
Hi, thank you for having me. I don't have any slides, it's just me talking. This is about 10 minutes, and if I go over, you can just close my mic off. Our culture has become increasingly interested in the problem of garbage. It's the most obvious sign of environmental degradation. Problem of garbage, where we put it, how much of it individuals make, how we can make less of it or recycle it, is all over the news. Generally speaking, when people talk about garbage, they mean municipal solid waste, or the kind of garbage that people rather than industry makes. That sort of garbage has the virtue, if that's the right word, of being immediately visible to us. It's easy to track. It's easy to understand the legislation and regulations about personal garbage, far more so than to track industrial pollution or toxins. And municipal solid waste, our stuff, your stuff, the overflowing trash can on the street, also has the benefit of lending itself to a certain kind of moral anxiety about our personal obligations to mitigate some element of the climate crisis. Garbage is particularly useful as an analytic because it is entailed by our individual choices and ways of assigning value to our things. Our anxieties about garbage threaten to overspill our usual way of making sense of objects, how assigning them their proper place in their lives takes up so much of our time. Even though we now take it for granted, we tend to think about garbage all the time because we are always making choices about our objects, distinctions among our things, using the naturalized standards of values of use and exchange. Is this worn out or is it new? Is there life still left in it? Is it broken or damaged beyond repair? Is it rare or replaceable? These questions help us figure out what counts as garbage, what we can throw away, and an object that we can keep because it has some useful life left in it, because it pleases us, because it has a particular kind of value we might not even have a name for yet. The same logic seems to hold for readers when they make conventional categorizations about information about novels or films. Is it garbage or does it have some redeeming moral or social value? Trashy books seem designed to be such by their content, and they have some correspondence with the pulps, those artifacts whose name was derived from the quality of the paper used to make them. It's easy to see how the metaphorical values of trash and garbage and waste have been used to talk about histories of reading practices, or how we think about the historical emergence of ways to classify taste or to target audiences, or to think about the rarity of some books and not others. But my work, which is generally about the circulation of garbage and what it tells us about how to represent the value of objects at different historical moments, has taught me to pay more attention to the end of the life cycle of objects. Though I am an environmental humanist and a scholar of 19th and 20th century US literature, I very rarely work on environmental literature or texts or print artifacts that have an already established value for environmental thinking or policy. I have looked rather at the sorts of texts that stage a drama about the value of objects and things, that pay attention to the moment when use value and exchange value are drained from ordinary life and ordinary things. So when I first began this project on garbage, domestic garbage in particular, municipal solid waste, and the representation of damaged objects, I thought about it in terms of books, in particular the artifact of the book, the paper version and the e-version. Then I thought I would talk about digital waste. And what I very quickly came to discover is that it is actually a lot easier to write an entire book on garbage and not an entire book on the afterlife or what I was sort of grimly calling the second to last day of the book's life. The most interesting thing about works on the afterlives of books, their second to last day, has been about their transformation into other kinds of objects. And I'm thinking here about Leah Price's work on the afterlives of books. And I see that Ellen Gruber Garvey is in the audience. And I was just reminded of her wonderful work on scrapbooks and many other scholars who have tried to describe how people treat book artifacts that are no longer useful as themselves. Similarly, you can find dozens, if not hundreds of websites that tell you how to make use of books that are no longer read, no longer loved, no longer valued. I can also say that the DIY situation about books that you can find all over the web is amazing. So the days when my mother would make a Christmas tree doorstop out of the Sears and Roebuck catalog have really come a long way. We threw that doorstop away. It ended up in the garbage, which is the fate of a great deal of environmental art, even those projects organized around book artifacts. And so I want to constellate how to think about books as garbage around one last point, which is ordinary collecting and salvaging. In 2 chapters of my current book, I write about our current fascination with hoarding, collecting, and decluttering. Every time I've given a paper about those subjects, I am inevitably asked by an academic if having a lot of books makes you a hoarder. Sometimes these questions are sort of joking and prideful, though it is never shocking when an academic thinks that it is weird to say that you have a house full of books. There are a few very curious academics that I've met who are very proud of having a house that has no books in it, and they are really interesting. Sometimes the question is a little anxious, and I can see the weight of those lovingly curated collections and their heavy shelves beginning to weigh on their owners. Who will take those books? Who will inherit my issue of a 1972 PMLA? The answer, by the way, is that a hoard and a collection are very different, but you can be a hoarder who only hoards books. But the question is interesting in itself. It matters that there is a moment when we have to imagine what to do with books that are no longer useful or valuable, when we have to contemplate how they will survive us, outlive us, when in fact they seem to have structured and animated our lives. In part, this is because we have a prohibition about destroying books. It strikes people as something akin to a religious taboo to destroy a book, though cultural critics like Ellen Garvey and Leah Price have revealed how many people have made use of the object of the book to create new textual artifacts, like scrapbooks, or simply to have the paper they were printed on. In these cases, the book does not go to waste any more than outhouses with catalog toilet paper went to waste or helped waste in any way. But the sacred aura around the book does not mean that all books are or can be preserved in the name of protecting a text. It does mean that we don't tend to think very much about where books go, where books and paper go when we get rid of them. We think about how the objects are made and the toxicity involved in that. We think about the carrying load, the environmental carrying load of distributing books, but we don't think about what they will do when they land in their very last home. We don't actually know that much about what happens to most books after we're done with them and we try and get rid of them. We know a lot more about, say, where our clothes and our plastic bottles go. And as you know, it is mostly in landfills or exported to other countries which do not actually want them. At the very end of the circuit of their lives, any book is designed to be like most books, unloved, untouched, and unread. And it is going to become garbage. Where did they go? A fraction of books are professionally destroyed each year. Expensive textbooks in particular are destroyed and shredded with some regularity, usually by companies that specialize in confidential book destruction. And those companies are very weird. It's hard to get exact figures because that information has tended to be proprietary. Publishers also shred or destroy remaindered books if they don't circulate them into the secondhand market. And we know that chain bookstores contract with publishers about the exact amount of time a book can be on the shelf before it will be sent back and either sent out into the secondary market or destroyed. Data can be gathered from publishers and booksellers and from presses about how many books have been published and sold and returned, but the bulk of books hanging around the world waiting to expire are yesterday's almost bestsellers. They are in the gray world of secondhand stores, individual online booksellers, garage sales, thrift stores, storage units, attics, and houses. They're everywhere. The United States, contrary to the political climate that we have all lived through, is actually drowning in paper and books. Though the problem of how libraries can store books has been discussed elsewhere, including in the American Library Association, for example, and their standards on how we deaccession books and what we do with them. It's actually a fairly small amount of books that are covered by such standards. The vast majority of books are lingering in their second to last resting place, but a great many more are simply thrown away. You can actually recycle your paperbacks, and they are recycled. We tend to hope, and we're right to hope, that many books drop into the half world of that secondhand trade. One way to think about books as environmental material, as garbage, is to try and figure out how, not just how they're made, how they're pulped, how much energy they use as they travel the world from place to place, how much storage space they take up, but how many of them will never even make the cut. Adam Minter, who was a great popularizer of the secondhand world and the salvaging world, has suggested some ways to think about the environmental impact of the materiality of books and paper. In his recent book, Secondhand, he writes about Book Off, Japan's largest used bookseller and buyer. He writes, not every used book has a buyer, and as a result, Book Off is likely Japan's largest book recycler. The company sends 35,000 tons of books to paper recyclers every year. That's 3.5 times the weight of the Eiffel Tower, measured out in individual unwanted volumes, romances, histories, dictionaries, classics. Describing the sorting process of books, he says, most books do not make it. 60% of the books that people give to giant resellers or resale wholesalers like Book Off have no value, and they are thrown away. Part of Minter's argument is that the secondhand trade in general is really hard to follow and count, even when we have data from big conglomerates. It's possible to get data about how much paper is recycled in the United States, how much is consumed, how much is thrown away. But the trouble is that there's little information about books that are almost or actually garbage. The data about paper is data about the waste stream. The EPA's recent figures tell us that the total generation of paper and paperboard in municipal solid waste was 67.4 million tons in 2018. So in Minter's logic, that's 7 Eiffel Towers. That is 23% of the total waste, municipal solid waste generated that year. 46 million tons of paper and paperboard were recycled in 2018 for a recycling rate of 68%, the highest compared to any other material. It's a pretty good rate of recycling for paper, and there are a lot of books in that recycling stream. Historically, landfills, we know, are thought to be up to 25% paper. And you can actually dig down into many landfills and still read perfectly preserved newspapers from the 19th century. Why am I giving you this data? Because our garbage in recycling is filled with paperbacks, hardbacks, newspapers, and novels that only yesterday were sitting in an attic, in a storage unit, or in a library. Many people have written about deaccessioning. Many scholars have thought about collecting and reusing and repurposing books and paper. There's a fair bit of work on the global trade in secondhand material, the cargo containers that move recycled commodities around the world. But we tend not to think about books as just paper. We want them to be texts before they're books. And this is an argument that is actually a really hard sell to environmental humanities people, though I recognize not such a hard sell to book history people. But they aren't texts before they're books. Their materiality has an environmental impact, and it is an environmental text because whether the book is Forever Amber or Silent Spring, it came from somewhere, it has to go somewhere, and it ends up in the global supply chain of garbage. Garbage is a commodity whose price and value changes daily, and it forms a critical part of overall global trade. Garbage is not an open book, but it is written in part on the most recycled commodity in the rich world. That is, it is written on the paper on which the texts we most loved, scorned, ignored, or despised were first written. Thank you.
Thanks, Stephanie. We'll move on to Matt Kirschenbaum, and do please note down your questions and save them for the end when we'll be using the raise hand function as always to take questions. Matt, take it away.
Hi, everybody. It's fun to be here. I've been looking forward to this and excited too, because this talk really follows, I think, beautifully from Stephanie's just now. So think of this as part 2, if I may. So like others of you, perhaps, I've been reading Richard Avenden's timely and harrowing book, Burning the Books. And in Abundance History and others more generally, flames are metonymic of the most malevolent stance one can muster toward books. But the truth is, books really fare no better with the elemental enemy of fire, which is, of course, water. So what would it mean then to think book history? And hopefully I'm sharing my screen now. Zach will flag me down if I'm not. What would it mean to think book history, not through the burning of books, but rather through their submersion, as I will do now with this book? Now, those of you who can make out the title may have already guessed the trick. The book is Aqua Erotica, subtitled 18 Stories for a Steamy Bath. And as you can see in the top right-hand corner, there's an umbrella-shaped emblem advertising this volume as a waterproof Durabook. Durabook is the retail branding of a bookmaking process patented by Charles Melcher in 2004. Melcher himself is a longtime innovator and entrepreneur in the book world, founder of Melcher Media, whose projects I discuss at length in my forthcoming bit streams, which Zach mentioned. Melcher's productions are, as I argue there, archetypes of what I term bookish media, not so much books as horizontally and vertically integrated media properties that happen to look and feel like books. The Durabook patent, which covers not just the paper, but also the binding materials and adhesives, is thus emblematic of a convergence between materials science and contemporary bookmaking that is, I believe, underappreciated. And I'll return to that point at the end. Held in the hand, though, a Durabook feels admirably book-like. It's only slightly heavier than a paperback book of the same page density and trim size. The leaves flex and bend easily. They cannot be easily dog-eared or torn, but the ink does not run, even if the book is sodden, as you see here. The ink itself is made by a vendor in Japan, even as the paper, which is a synthetic called polypropylene, is sourced from a manufacturer in Taiwan. While Durabooks hold promise in varied domains, for example, maps and charts and other reading material for the great outdoors, what we would nowadays doubtlessly refer to as tactical reading matter, their application in commercial publishing seems to have petered out after some initial enthusiasm. Most all of the Durabook titles I've located fall into the category of novelty books, either books that are for kids or else books that are, like this one, very much for adults. All of them also rely on the thematic convergence of subject and material, playing up the ostensibly perilous juxtaposition of books, bathtubs, and beaches. But it turns out that this genre had its limits, and most readers were never that fazed by the prospect of taking a paperback to the pool or a book to the beach or even into their bath. Keeping Dostoevsky safe from the surf, as the New York Times put it in its Durabook coverage, was not a publishing priority. But there's at least one title that elevates Durabooks from a novelty, or what CNI has helpfully theorized as the gimmick, to something more suggestive. In 2002, the environmentalists William McDonough and Michael Braungart published Cradle to Cradle with North Point Press, which is a division of FSG, using Melcher's services and Durabook materials. McDonough and Braungart are an architect and a chemist, respectively. They believe that traditional recycling, or so-called cradle-to-grave thinking, which I think is what Stephanie was just describing for us, merely prolongs the inevitable. Sooner or later, as Stephanie was saying, all consumables become waste, even if they enjoy an extended life through an additional product cycle or two beforehand. The alternative is a renewable and wholly regenerative approach, or waste equals food in their pithy summation. Cradle to Cradle, which is their manifesto, begins with a chapter touting Durabook technology as a model of just this kind of upcycling. A book is not a tree, the chapter is called. Using the second person you, it places the reader in a familiar scene of reading, a comfortable armchair and other domestic surroundings. But these are quickly revealed as menacing, even toxic. The fabric of the chair, for example, may contain carcinogens. Quote, as you shift in your seat, particles of the fabric abrade and are taken up by your nose, mouth, and lungs, the reader is warned. Eventually, the chair itself will end up in a landfill. By contrast, not only is the Durabook waterproof and durable and conventionally recyclable, it is also, as they put it, quote, a technical nutrient, a product that can be, quote, broken down and circulated infinitely in industrial cycles. Made and remade, used and reused ad infinitum, whether as paper or as ingredients in other products. Now, as you can imagine, this is more often an ideal than a scalable strategy or solution in most industries, but still McDonough and Braungart's ideas have been influential. So I want to leave you this evening with two provocations. The first is this. The period in which Durabook was innovated, patented, and implemented from the mid-90s through the early and mid-aughts coincides with the period of book history that is dominated by ebook devices like the Kindle in what have already become the entrenched narratives of the book's technological transformation. Likewise, the same time frame is the golden age of the death of the book debates, period pieces which seem quaint to us even now, but which framed the future of the Codex in terms of stark binaries, either evangelical or elegiac. Durabooks and Melchamedia's work more generally, I would argue, offer a glimpse of what it might mean to trace alternative genealogies, genealogies which run not from page to pixel or hardware to software, but otherwise, through the industrial labs of advanced materials science. Put plainly, there's more to the technology of 21st century bookmaking than digitality. The second and perhaps more provocative speculation is this. Whether upcycling or downcycling, there is a real sense in which recycling is the enemy of book history. If books are not preserved in their material forms, we have no objects of study. Moreover, the very wasting and physical degradation of books has, especially in recent scholarly trends, been embraced as generative. This is true not only at the level of social and cultural history, but in terms of pursuits like proteomics and the Folgers Project Dust Bunny. Now, one could counter that. Of course, it's always been the function of libraries and archives to ensure that a small and select specimen of materials is preserved for posterity, regardless of whether the majority are pulped and discarded. But still, I think the absolutism of McDonough and Braungart's philosophy is worth lingering over, for it has implications for our own value systems. In essence, it consists in an overturning of materiality, the aspiration through material science itself of an infinitely renewable or refreshable world where the molecular ingredients, nutrients of things can be used again and again with neither wear nor residual remainders, the book traces that scholars such as us so prize. In this, there is a suggestive symmetry to the e-ink technology of the original Kindle, which was similarly premised on very tiny beads of matter that could be refreshed and realigned without leaving any trace or residue in the substrate. This is descriptive not exclusively of electronic devices, but more generally of what Ian Bogost has termed unit operations, a materiality made of the configurable, interlocking, and the discrete that can be atomic or chemical, as well as digital. It may be then that the deepest reservoirs of future book history lie there, in the material particulars of particulates of matter, where we learn how the page matters by learning how the page gets made into matter in the first place. Thank you.
Thank you, Matt. The ripples on water challenge Zoom's capability for streaming and create some nice effects.
But you know that this is real water and not just a Zoom filter that I'm using.
Yes. Yeah, it works. Thanks for that.
Thanks. Would you unshare me, Zach?
Yes, let me do that. There we go. Okay, so let's move to Iris next.
Great. Can you hear me and see the slides?
Yes.
Yes, fantastic. All right, well, thank you so much for this opportunity. I'm very grateful to the community of the History of Material Texts and the organizers for this chance to present some of my work. Today, I will really like to invite you to go somewhere far and long ago and talk about one really special and quite uniquely material text produced in 16th century Mexico, a few decades after Spanish colonization began. And here I want to just to use this map as an aid to help us move in time and space to this geography and to locate ourselves in this world that was quickly changing, from the 1520s to the 1570s when the text that I will be talking about was produced. I'm referring to a text commonly known as the Florentine Codex, which is a manuscript currently lodged in the Medicean library in Florence, and which was produced during a period of almost 20 years by a group of people organized by a Franciscan missionary who, together with indigenous informants and indigenous intellectuals, produced what has been called a Mexican encyclopedia, a work that is modeled after Pliny's Naturalis Historia, the Roman naturalist who around the year 79 of the Common Era produced this massive encyclopedic work trying to describe everything that could be known in the Roman Empire about the earth, animals, the skies, how people behaved and were, etc. An encyclopedic view of the world. Emulating that model, the Florentine Codex is organized in 12 books. And here you can see more or less how these books are thematically organized from the gods, the feasts of the gods, everything that had to do with divinity, then with calendrical knowledge, then with rhetoric, which is one of the few exceptions in the Plinian model, and we'll say a tiny bit more about that. Astrology, knowledge of the skies, then human organization, and then the natural things, so plants, animals, minerals, and finally, another exception to the Plinian model, a book on the conquest of Mexico. So book 6 and book 12 are the only two that don't fit clearly into the Plinian model of organization of this encyclopedia. Book 6 is devoted to rhetoric and moral philosophy, and is basically recovering a lot of the oral tradition that the Nahua people of central Mexico used to transmit their forms of knowledge. And then book 12, as I said, is devoted to the conquest in particular. Just to give you some idea of what scholars have thought about this text, this is pretty much what we could consider a hybrid text, a mestizo text, or in the terminology of Marcy Norton, who I think is with us today, it's an entangled text that is having this different kinds of agency operating at the same time. There are very clear European influences. Apart from Pliny, it's following some medieval encyclopedias like De Propietatibus Rerum by Bartholomeus Anglicus, or herbals like Johann de von Cuves' Hortus Sanitatis, but it also has a very strong indigenous imprint. As I said, it has been termed the Mexican encyclopedia just because of the breadth of the knowledge it is expressing in the Nahuatl language as one of its texts, the indigenous language of central Mexico. It has been also described as 3 books in one because it also has a Spanish translation of that Nahuatl text. And in addition to those 2, it is copiously illustrated. It has over 2,000 illustrations, which are not merely illustrations, actually. And this is one of the arguments I have made in some of my work. This is a third discourse that is expressing particularly native ideas into the text. So in the rest of my time, I would like to briefly talk to you about the process of how the Florentine Codex was made, and then about some notions of seasonality, in particular, the 2 main seasons that orchestrated, really organized Nahua life, Nahua productive life and ceremonial life before the Spaniards arrived, and how I think some of these notions of seasonality of the dry and rainy seasons are actually incorporated into the structure of the Codex itself. This codex, as I mentioned at the beginning, was produced over a period of almost 20 years. And it started with a series of interviews that this Franciscan friar, Bernardino de Sahagún, carried out with elders in a town called Tepepulco. He had a questionnaire of things that he wanted to ask, and he approached these elders who at the beginning gave their answers in paintings, in drawings, which was a main way of memory keeping in pre-conquest Mexico. And then over time, these images were described by people called colegiales, people who had already been trained in Spanish and Latin and who were able to translate those images produced by their elders. There's a second phase of production of this codex a few years later in a different town, the town of Tlatelolco, with more interviews with different groups of elders and more experimentation with regards to the format of the codex. At this stage, there was the introduction of a third column besides the Nahuatl and the Spanish column that is believed to serve the function of actually teaching the language to new missionaries. So this is a column that would have had notes stressing important Nahuatl terms and their Spanish translation, so that when actually looking at this text, missionaries would be learning key terms in Nahuatl. And then finally, we have the version that we know as the Florentine Codex, which was produced between 1575 and 77, and is the one that we will be talking about for the remainder. Just to present to you a typical page of the Florentine Codex and how it looks like, we see here a page that has to do with rain and with, oh my God, I'm forgetting the word for granizo, sleet, I think. But what I want you to notice is how the column on the right is a column in the Nahuatl language. Then the column on the left is translated into Spanish. It is never a full translation of the text. There is a lot of selection. There is a lot of cultural translation, as we would probably call it. Like, for example, deities are usually called just demons in the Spanish texts. And then we have the visual element that is very, very strong and that really holds a whole different discourse occurring in the Codex. Talking about the season specifically, these 2 main seasons, the rainy season and the dry season, are organizing everything in Nahua life. They are organizing the year, and what I'm showing to you here is a representation of the ritual calendar with the 18 months of the Aztec calendar. And in yellow, I have signaled the months and feasts that correspond to the month Tonalco, to the dry season, and in green, the months that correspond to Chopan, to the rainy season. And each of these seasons is governed by a deity. Tonalco is governed by a war god, Huitzilopochtli. a solar god, and this is the season, this is the time when the earth is resting. It's the dry time, it is a time of expansion, it is a time of commerce, it is a time of travel, and it is a time of war. And then in green we have the season called Chopin, that is usually ruled by Tlaloc, an ancient rain deity that is the main recipient of sacrifice and of petitions for rain, for the generosity of the land, and for bringing abundance during the main season of maize. Just to give you a sense of what these two words mean, Chopin, the green season, derives from Cho, which means greenness, and Pan, which means at the time of in Nahuatl. And Tonalco derives from tonali, which means heat of the sun, and a locative suffix co to say the time of the heat of the sun. Now, seasons are also organized space. And remember that map, the Cortez map I showed you at the beginning, with the center, the ceremonial center so prominently displayed. This is a representation of the main temple, the Templo Mayor, there at the center, the ceremonial center of what would have been Mexico Tenochtitlan when the Spaniards arrived. And we see how this temple is divided with two altars between these two gods, between Tlaloc on the left and Huitzilopochtli on the right. Huitzilopochtli is usually represented as this hummingbird god, usually with a hummingbird beak. And so we see that this notion that these two gods are there organizing the year is also represented through space and organizing the ritual ceremonial space in Mexico Tenochtitlan. Here you would see a kind of a projection of the scale that this temple would have had in contemporary Mexico, just to give you an idea, and the two altars prominently displayed there too. Now, my interest in this notion of seasonality within the Codex has been triggered by noticing that it is possible that this notion of Chopin and Tonalco, the rainy season and the dry season, are also expressed in the structure of this encyclopedic codex. And I first noticed this when I found two twin images of Tlaloc and Huitzilopochtli, which are located respectively in Book 6 on rhetoric and in Book 11 on natural things, or the natural history, and which are really kind of occupying a very similar place on the page and are basically evoking the two main activities that the gods would have been central for in this ritual organization of the year. Just to show you where these two are in kind of the organization of the Codex. These are the two pages. So on the left, we have the page on Book 6 on rhetoric, where we see Tlaloc, and on the right, we see Huitzilopochtli in Book 11 on the natural history as a hummingbird god receiving what looks like a human heart. Now, just to conclude this idea that this seasonal structure is also being represented here. What's happening in Book 6 when we find this Tlaloc image, this twin image to Huitzilopochtli, more or less in the same posture, and this contrapposto with the same leg above or forward, wearing the same kind of loincloth, also lifting their right arm, is that on the left, Tlaloc is being addressed by priests to ask for rain, to ask for water. And they're asking also for the blooming season to begin. They're asking for birds to return. They're asking for life to awaken in some way. And as I said, this is included in Book 6, which is a book on rhetoric, and which includes all kinds of prayers, pre-Columbian prayers to these main deities, all of them of some agricultural nature, some of them, I mean, all of them really referring to the continuation of this cycle ruled by seasonality. On the right, we have Huitzilopochtli represented not as a human carrying a hummingbird beak headdress, but as an actual hybrid figure, half man, half hummingbird, receiving what looks like a heart from a falcon, and this image is in the entry on the falcon in book 9, the natural history, and basically receiving this very central symbol for sacrifice, basically receiving the offering of a heart, which would have been payment for the gifts that Tlaloc would have provided to the people, closing this cycle in which one god is governing the season of agricultural production, and the other one is governing the season of dryness and commerce and war, and receiving the gift that humans are providing. So there are many questions that emerge from me from finding these correspondences, iconographic correspondences between these two images that I'm only now starting to research. But for me, it was important to show you and to present how, in this context, the production of such a hybrid text, we're seeing really old traditional ideas about how this world is organized ritually, spatially, and in terms of the calendar, imprinted in this very European genre of the encyclopedia, and reworked in ways that really will survive to our days and offer really fascinating opportunities for new interpretations. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Iris. That was great. I'm gonna, oh, there we go. Excellent. So now we'll turn to our fourth and last presentation, JT, and then we will have plenty of time for questions. Go ahead, JT.
Okay, thank you all. Thanks to the organizers, and thanks to my wonderful co-panelists for your fascinating talks. That was really interesting. I'm talking more about a kind of digital text, and I can talk more about its materiality and immateriality towards the end when I center it. So I'll just jump in. In a 1980 recording of work songs from Virginia, released as part of the Smithsonian's Folkway series, Lena Thompson, Lucy Scott, and Lucy Smith, 3 crab pickers in Bluff Point, Virginia, along the Potomac, sing a work song, Sleep On. The central theme of the spiritual's lyrics are death. Sleep on, mother, lay down and get your rest, Thompson calls out, followed with vocal accompaniment from Smith and Scott. As they go through repeated rounds, imploring their mother, father, and others to ease into eternal rest, sleep and rest, the sounds of their labor, the sloshing sound of removing crab meat from shells, forms the ambient backdrop of their vocals. As the liner notes document, the song was recorded at a crab meat production plant that was the last of its kind in the Northern Neck region of Virginia. While the blue crab figures centrally in the cultural life of Black communities along the Potomac and in many rural and urban communities, starting with slavery, what I'm really interested in is kind of shifting location through commercialization in the 19th century, industrialization of the waterscape, and how we might use that to think about a more contemporary text. So as James V. Dean, a former Maryland slave born on a plantation along an inlet on the Maryland side of the Potomac, recalled to an interviewer, my choice food was fish and crabs cooked in styles by my mom or mother. Here it's significant that Dean's preferred foods were products of this delicate watershed and brackish ecologies that constitute the primary contours of this region, and that it was prepared by his mother. Food that enslaved folks independently procured from the waters of the Potomac and similar estuary environments, as well as the labor, particularly centering Black women as what Joy James terms captive maternals, in the process of food production and preparation, serves as a kind of currency for forms of insurgent Black social life and intergenerational affection in the face of dominion, starvation, and forced dislocation. The water served as a kind of Black commons, as I've written about, a furtive and sometimes failed challenge to dominion, enacted in the interstices and edges of plantation society. And of course, the downloading of the plot and the responsibility of feeding oneself in this context is is ultimately a kind of downloading of responsibility for food onto enslaved folks themselves. But as I've written about, it becomes a whole other thing in the hands of the enslaved, right? There's all kinds of, Dean and other folks talking about going and fishing in the middle of the night with their friends. It starts to stretch the time and spatial parameters of the plantation. And of course, during the Civil War, key sites of these kinds of enactments of the Black Commons and the kinds of futurity and all of that that's enacted through that was, as basically destroyed, along with the wider infrastructure, plantations, roads, bridges, especially in Virginia and also other large segments of the South, as Du Bois, documents in his magisterial 1935 Black Reconstruction. The Potomac and the other waterways in the Tidewater were also fortified and weaponized, foreclosing the historical relationship of these sites and re-territorializing the interstices of plantations as sites of even more intensive danger and violence. And of course, near the zones of open conflict, former slaves faced down war as what Du Bois described as more murder, force, and anarchy, seeking to free themselves in this context. Later, during the Jim Crow commercialization of leisure and waterscapes and fisheries in the South, that's all, we could talk more about how that's one thing. And the rapid industrialization of the Chesapeake's fisheries in the 1880s, waterscapes shifted from being spaces of fleeting Black sovereignty and a fugitive Black commons to spaces from which Black communities were prohibited or in which they served as in an ongoing way as fungible bodies in the extraction work of fisheries and as stevedores and the nascent steamboat infrastructures that served as the region's primary modes of transportation and exploitation and extraction. In his 1930 Rural Negro, historian Carter G. Woodson describes the shifting nature of local and regional waterscapes and the cultural lives of Black people living in the rural South after emancipation, and especially in the 1920s, while ongoing large baptisms and creeks, rivers, ponds, and lakes at seashores signified enduring spiritual and social connections to the various kinds of waterscapes across the South as a region. Commercialization and enclosure threatened more quotidian uses and attachments to these various water and landscapes. According to Woodson, Black people were increasingly, quote, turned away from the bathing beach, which was once a free-for-all swimming place, not admitted to the private game reserve, which occupied the old fishing and hunting grounds, and prohibited from having, quote, any parties on the placid lake where they once rowed their canoes without fear of disturbance. As Woodson documents it, the discommoning of waterways and the erection of racially exclusive commercialized leisure undermined Black people's abilities to access water and gave powerful significance to Jim Crow's early 20th century consolidation. And I want to highlight especially the endurance of hunger, right, as a condition of Black life, just to kind of force, we could talk more about that, but particularly hunger is what I'm interested in. And the spiritual with which I begin in this context, and that's of course recorded much later, but in this context of a longer trajectory of discommoning, appropriation, extractionism, and exploitation of the water, ecotone through commercialization takes on new light. The spiritual served as a living intergenerational archive centering the theme of death. It drives a metaphor equating death with rest in the context of tedious commercialized crab picking. These women versed in the old work song tradition, documenting the ongoing expression of collective Black working class ecological social description and analysis around life, death, and being in the watery, soggy land of this ecotone in the Tidewater, is, akin to the kind of blues, spiritual, gospel epistemology, I'm riffing off Clyde Woods here, that animates Black cultural life. These women, though no one perhaps took them seriously as environmentalists because of the dynamics of race, gender, class, and region that disqualify Black Southern working class women from meaningful knowledge, communal analysis about the relationship between their labor exploitation, the proximity of their kin and community to death under these conditions, and the power of their collective sonic work to forward vitality in the face of environmental degradation, exposure, tedium, and poverty, I think is a significant work. But I want to finally turn to my object of analysis. And of course, it's not a book in the same, but it's something that it's a common kind of non-textual format that shows up on Facebook. So we're going to run with Facebook as the book in this context. So I'm going to share my screen just so you can have a sense of what I'm saying. Give me 1 second. Okay. Oh. Doesn't seem to appear. Hold on. I'm not seeing the QuickTime show up for some reason, and we just had it. Well, anyway, I'm going to move on. The clip I wanted to show you was a kind of common type of clip that's very gendered in the context of Virginia and the kinds of social worlds that people create on social media, but of someone fishing. And, you know, I recorded this at Gloucester Point in 2019, which is at a sort of meeting point of two rivers, smaller rivers to form a larger river, the York. And you can see in the background as I'm recording fishing that someone, as I'm recording someone fishing, that there is, you know, that there is some kind of, I think actually paper mill, apropos of an earlier talk, a paper mill in the background. And we could talk about the connections there. But I wanted to talk about the clip in particular. It's, you know, it's in the same region as this recording, obviously in a very different moment. And Gloucester's, of course, well, maybe y'all don't know this, but close to my hometown, along with these other places. So this is a very personal project. But it's this area, Gloucester Point, is one of the very few areas in Virginia, in this part of Virginia, where you can fish without a license, right? And so we can talk more about what that means. But let me note that, like all tickets and licenses in Virginia, despite its kind of current blue status, are racist, right? Who they police around license and uses of fishing, and also who they police around illegal catches is often who they police on highways and everywhere else. So, and I don't want to make this kind of particular visual text, you know, I don't want to act like this is not out of a larger context. I think, you know, while Black folks are policed around license and fishing, you know, there are new ventures all along the Rappahannock and the Potomac, for example, for oyster extraction, right? That have no plans of actually ameliorating the water system, the brackish system, but just kind of have figured out a way to kind of manipulate oysters to grow very quickly under certain kinds of conditions. So I'm trying to juxtapose here this kind of line fishing with ongoing commercialization in this context. And so, and of course, the condition of the clip that I wanted to share is discommoning and pollution in rural Tidewater, Virginia. So part of it is, of course, you can see the kind of pollution that I'm referring to in the background with a paper mill in the backdrop, but also ongoing discommoning. Part of the reason that we were even there and I was recording, I went with my cousins and family to fish there, is that there are no accessible beaches in Tappahannock, where I'm from, right? So we have to drive 45 minutes to get to a place where you can have have license-free fishing. And this is particularly acute in this moment where not only DC and Northern Virginia retirees, but also increasingly in the age of COVID, folks who don't have to go to a particular place to work anymore, who are driving in these enclosures, right? So, and I want to close with this. It's in this kind of context that, a public beach at Dunsville, Virginia, a small little area that you would blink and not see if you don't know where you're going, was one of the few remaining public access points to the Rappahannock River in this area. And a retiree built a massive and totally ridiculous house right by the water and right by this former beach, which they quickly closed the beach to protect. I say ridiculous because this house is not even on stilts, and this house is going to be underwater in 10 years max, right? So there's a kind of denial on a closure out of Black people from these kinds of spaces for wealthy folks who are coming from out of town. And that denial has a long history, but also, as I pointed to with Woodson, et cetera, but it's also tied more recently to a rash in the last couple of years of Black drowning deaths. Black communities are alienated from the river, and increasingly youth who don't know how to swim are dying, right? It has real consequences. And so I wanted to pose the fishing thing as, like, how do we think about, in the text, how do we think about these posts, common posts from Virginia, particularly around Black men, cis men, that are as ecological texts in conversation intertextually with these older archives of recorded sound, et cetera, from the region? What are the stakes of viewing Black communities as progenitors of futures defined by communality and reciprocity, rather than as victims of extraction and violence? And how can we use these to map alternatives already in play, to think about how to create broader ecologies of resilience and possibility in the face of post-oil futures? So I'll stop there.
Thanks, JT, and sorry about the tech problem. I don't know if that was on our end, but if you find it, you could show it to us during Q&A so we can see the kind of posts that you're talking about. Okay, so we're open for Q&A for all of our speakers. And if you want to use the raise hand function, you'll pop up in my queue and I can call on you. If you prefer to put your comment or question in the chat, I'll try to go through there and pull out some questions as well. I see, just to get us started, maybe a question from Leah Price in the chat. Stephanie, you seem to bracket content, whereas Matt, you talked about the thematic convergence that kids' bath books share with aqua erotica. How do these materialist accounts challenge more thematically oriented modes of environmental humanities? And given that the first two talks provoked laughter, why is that overdetermined conjunction of materiality with thematic so often yoked with embarrassed or rueful laughter?
I mean, I don't have any particularly profound insight into that. I do want to go on record that I was not claiming a thematic convergence between the kids' books and the and aqua erotica, which seems important to clarify. But I think the reason that we sort of respond to that kind of thing, I mean, I think probably the person who has thought, I mean, certainly the person who's thought most deeply about this is, again, Sian Nye, who works precisely with affective responses like the kind of laughter that's provoked by submerging a book in a tub of water. I do think there's also the fact that there is that kind of response suggests the power of what we call, by way of shorthand, materiality, and that there are other ways of working with and working through materiality that similarly provoke responses in us.
Well, that was such a good answer. I wish I had one as good. One of the things that that happens when you study garbage is that, and you're a literary scholar, is that your first turn is to say that, oh, garbage is, and I am saying this, the most concentrated text of the Anthropocene. That is the text. And then the second is to think, why is my recourse always to textuality with a really sort of specific move? And so one of the things that I've been trying to think about is, and this is actually one of the reasons I was drawn to books as garbage and later decided not to include that, is because they're already so overdetermined as the sort of carrier of greater cultural meanings that it's hard for people to toggle back and forth between a kind of materiality and a sacralized sense of what a book is. And I think that environmental humanities has done an amazing job at tracing the not just the thematic evolution of environmental thinking, but in tracing the fact that it wasn't a linear progression, that all of these things have been happening around and at different times, and they sort of stutter and stop, and they reimagine the past, and they imagine new futures that we haven't yet achieved. For me, that always is the problem of garbage, that it is a sort of deeply condensed temporality. And so just as a thought experiment, I was kind of interested to see what happens if you reduce book to paper, right? But I haven't thought much about the affective response to that. And I will when this semester finally ends, which it never will. So maybe I'll never be able to think about it, but thank you for that question.
Okay, again, do put your hands up. So if you're willing to ask your question on screen, it's nice to get some faces to the question. But there is another question in the chat from Jinwoo Choi. How did the portrayal and knowledge of season specific to Mexico in the Florentine Codex inform or engage with contemporary or later European discussions of seasonality around the world? That's for you, Iris.
Thank you. Well, you see that mostly happening in the Spanish column. So you see that happening in the effort to translate what the Nahuatl terms are. And there you see that often error is inserted when attempting to translate. For example, tonalco is translated into Spanish as invierno, as winter. But that is a very imperfect way to translate it because it doesn't have to do with temperature at all. It has to do with a lack of rain. So you see all kinds of translation problems emerging from that. And then you see in the Spanish, some attempts at creating words for fall or spring for the intermediate seasons, but they are never present in the Nahuatl column. So you see how there are two worlds collaborating there. And when you look at the contrast between the columns, it becomes very clear that there are still two worlds operating at once in the same manuscript. In reception, you see, engagements with other regions as well, but this is a very concrete community producing this text. They are, Acosta is not yet published. It's from 1590, and texts, for example, Garcilaso is also, early 17th century. So those texts are not yet circulating, and you don't see that kind of influence yet. It will come later.
Yeah, there was another question back in the chat while people are formulating their questions, but I don't know who's from because it's from someone whose name is iPhone KMR. A question again for you, Iris. Do the different forms of bird beaks in the presentation of the heart to Tlaloc have significance, seasonal or otherwise? Oh, I see, it's Karen Reed. So she's asking about that last illustration.
Thank you, Karen. That's an offering to Huitzilopochtli, actually, to the hummingbird god. But yes, beaks are important because I briefly mentioned that image is inserted in the entry on a kind of hawk, quadplotly, an eagle falcon. And my interpretation why that is there is that the indigenous intellectuals working with Sagun are very knowledgeable about Pliny by then. Because if you go to Pliny and his description of falcons, you see that he says that falcons don't eat the hearts of the birds they prey. And so that dietary restriction on Plinian falcons could have been a very interesting way of inserting kind of this particular function of the ceremonial heart within the Codex and in the entry on falcons, not in the entry on hummingbirds, not in the entry of the gods, not in the entries of ceremonies or anything like that, but in a kind of in a Plinian footnote. So it is relevant, very relevant, actually.
Peter.
Unmute. There we go. Am I unmuted? Okay. Just a comment to begin with, which is the relationship between trash and, you know, when we talk about sort of trashy books, that Aqua Erotica is edited by Marianne Mohanraj, who's an American writer. She's an academic. She was born in Sri Lanka. And she's actually an associate professor at the University of Illinois at Chicago. And she's written books like Catherine in the City, A Choose Your Own Erotic Adventure, and The Classics Professor, A Choose Your Own Erotic Adventure. So I was just intrigued by that, you know, the notion that this is actually seems to be more and more common, that there are these straightforward overlaps. But the question really for all the panelists, including sort of JT, we're thinking about it, when you think about the relationship between why a song, for instance, gets preserved. And it seems to me useful to think about why something, I mean, basically, I completely agree with what Stephanie is saying. Everything really is waste. Everything's going to be waste. And the things, you have to explain why something isn't going to be waste. And normally it's because I think of a suturing to a narrative, and relic's the extreme example of that. A relic is something that is literally nothing. It's just a bit of bone or a bit of hair or something, you know. But once you say it's Mary Magdalene's hair, it now gets a value. And if the narrative that attaches to that object or that piece of music gets lost. So, you know, even obviously some things get conserved for very official reasons, all sorts of things. The Beatles will get conserved. A particular Beatles record, though, may get preserved for quite other reasons, that it's got a particular association with someone's memory of 1968, you know, what they were listening to then. And the moment that link is cut, there's, you know, the person dies, it's not likely to be preserved. You know, most things are not likely to be preserved. That particular copy is not likely to be preserved anyway. So I was just thinking about the question for all the panelists, you know, what the importance of narrative is in attaching to an object or to a song or to, so I was thinking in the case of JT, I mean, even that question there about why a song gets preserved, why it suddenly comes back into focus. Your work brings it back into focus. Your work is actually a narrative that attaches then and makes it into something. So it's just thinking of that work that attaches a narrative to an object. So I just wondered if any of you could have any comments or thoughts about that.
JT, do you want to take that?
Sure. I think I can also just, while I'm responding, hopefully also pull up this clip so you have a better sense of what, there's no sound, I've turned it down on purpose. But I think definitely, I mean, that's part of the kind of insurgent work of the Black Ecologies work that we've been doing, is to kind of understand and to, I guess, bring into light and bring into significance by suturing in many ways to a critique of the Anthropocene as a discourse, with this kind of flattening of for the first time, Black communities are included as full human in sort of, Western thought and discourse is as co-contributors to ecological destruction without kind of attending to histories of slavery and colonization and violence. And disposability. That's another rub I'd love to talk about, as well as the kind of, especially through Sylvia Wynter and that classic plotting essay, the kind of intertextual nature of disposability between paper, books, and Black people, like Black bodies, right? That especially given the kind of Codex stuff, that there's something going on about there's a swirl there in terms of colonization and slavery that is very much at the front of some of the other kind of more material stuff that we've been talking through, and disposability more broadly. But I mean, that's the insurgent work that we're working through with Black Ecologies, is to recover. And I think this is recorded as part of folkways, right? It's part of this is a dying, relic, not in the same sense that you used it, but this is a dying kind of cultural phenomenon. There are all these recordings of work songs taken in Virginia in this period. It goes along with this kind of impulse, again, I think, to catalog in many ways conquest and enclosure, right? And to go back to a kind of resonance with the Codex, it's with that third column that you introduced, that's about that is about conquest, or that chapter that's about conquest. I think very much these folkway recordings happen in a similar way, right? The kinds of, on the Potomac specifically, I mean, we can think about the kind of literal Smithsonian's relationship along a riverway, right? And Washington, metropolitan Washington, in relation to the kind of destruction of some of these ecotones through particularly through suburbanization in Maryland and all of that. I'm kind of, jumping around, but that's a great question. I think, and again, I'll just come back to underscore that's our work. I think we are trying to suture new meaning to what are considered otherwise ephemeral, unmeaningful, meaningless texts produced in Black cultural life that are viewed as only evidence or a kind of timestamp of Black disappearance. And trying to take those together as meaningful understandings, not only about the kind of environmental crises that Black communities have faced since the 15th century, with indigo and other, toxic ecologies and et cetera, dumping, disposability, all of that, to make meaning out of those, and to tie those again to the contemporary discussion in the environmental humanities that privileges Anthropocene discourse.
I see Carrie McAuliffe has a question. Go ahead.
Thanks, Zach. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for these wonderful talks. I got so much out of it. This is a little bit across the board because I'm thinking about submergence and water, but I'm especially, I think, responding to JT, who's given me so many things to think about, especially around waterways. The background of this is, for a while, I've been wrestling with how to reckon with and think about my grandmother's a librarian, and she had a collection of books that got flooded in Houston, and her whole collection was flooded. And it changed a lot of the decisions that you had to make around salvaging and saving, and how do you save, which raised for me a lot more questions about precarity, salvaging, and the designation of debris along the Gulf Coast, and specifically Gulf Coast histories and Black histories. This also, of course, merges because that fascinating site was also, a critical times part of, colonized Mexico or New Spain. And specifically even thinking about Galveston as it is, now a popular tourist destination for Estonians, where the Black community has mostly been moved and consigned into smaller housing and old and decrepit housing in the middle of the city, with the island being more stilted vacation homes, as you kind of mentioned. So I guess this background is just to say, I'm thinking about these sites that are also prone to ecological disaster, and how that affects both the archives that are in them and the very material conditions of preservation, and also the very communities who have the least resources and have been consigned historically, especially Black communities. I'm thinking of Louisiana as well, to be most prone to the hardship and violence of disaster. The fact that the environmentalism there is racist. And all of that is, I guess I'm wondering then how, thinking about all of your work across sort of submergence and debris, of how even the encounter with that event of flood, or even the moment where it would seem to make trash or make debris, opens up a different kind of reckoning with an object or certain kinds of histories. I'm specifically wondering, like, what that moment does, and what do we do with texts that are not fully in the landfill, but are in the process of decaying, that have growth, that are molding, and maybe be tied and capturing information about these spaces and communities. Sorry, that was long. Thank you.
That is a great question, and I'll just give it a small stab because I'm sure other people have more interesting things to say than I do. That moment is exactly the moment I'm interested in. And I was thinking about the earlier question that Peter Stalbras asked, which is how, most things are going to be garbage. And so the work of commemoration and curation happens around certain kinds of narratives, but in the ordinary object world that I'm most interested in, and I should say that the garbage that I talk about, municipal solid waste, our garbage, is roughly 2.5% of the pollution and toxicity and waste that is generated by capitalist countries. Like, it's not fracking water, it's not ash from factories. It's a tiny amount, but it's the stuff that we care about, and it's the stuff that we can see. And a lot of what I'm finding is, and somebody put something in the comments about hoarding, and it's very much about hoarding, is it's the ordinary object world. It's less about the narratives that attach to things and more about an embodied relationship to things. So the value comes from the fact that they have once been touched by someone and that you care about them. And so that opens up a kind of line of thinking about the actual toxicity of most objects when they begin to decay, because we think about the touch as a kind of magical, affective giving of value. But what we see is that there is a kind of gross interpenetration of decay and embodiment around text. And this is happening now thematically in lots of science fiction around garbage and decay in books and bodies, and how that triangulates histories that haven't been heard before. So that's how I've started to think about it, but I'm sure others have more interesting things to say.
Does one of the other panelists want to jump in?
I mean, if I may, I think the ideas you put on the table are very central for any corpus that emerges out of colonized or very unequal circumstances, and for the documents that kind of are part of the group of the Florentine Codex, which I must say it's quite an exceptional document just because of its scope and the process of its production. It's kind of a one-off, but we know that the corpus of pre-conquest and early colonial codices, I mean, we have just this tiny slice of what existed. And in our present moment, that brings up such complicated questions, right? Because the things that have survived often have left Mexico. They are somewhere else, as is the case of the Florentine Codex. And so, you know, that fact raises very complicated ethical questions about what to do with these things. Should we talk about repatriation, even though the fact that this codex, you know, has been fully digitized and it will be digitized again in an even better version by the Getty Institute at the moment, and is made fully available, and it's moving scholarship forward. You know, that hasn't been stopped by the fact that has been abroad. But I think as scholars, we do have a very big responsibility of translating what we are learning through painstaking work and making it available for the relevant people, you know, I mean, who are the heirs or the people of the people who produce these texts. So, and there are really fascinating projects translating, for example, the last book of the Florentine Codex, which is a book on the conquest, to contemporary variants of Nahuatl. Nahuatl is a very diverse language. There are around 30 variants. And so the classical Nahuatl of the Codex is no longer spoken, but there are many variants, and there are scholars, among them Eduardo de la Cruz, contemporary Nahua speaker, who is translating that book into his variant and then bringing it back to his community to teach the children about the version of the conquest in that book, and kind of relearning history, you know, through indigenous version of the story. So it is, there's fascinating work like that starting to happen, but I think it is part of what we need to do as well. And it's a bigger discussion about the academy and what counts, right? Because that usually doesn't count, and it should be one of the most important things that we are doing with the skills we have, which takes so much time to learn and are kind of wasted talking just amongst ourselves.
Can I jump in very quickly? I wanted to say very quickly, that's why Black expressive cultures, I'm thinking about Lyndon Barrett's kind of work around value and Blackness and singing and signing. I think that's part of why Justin Hosby and I, through the Black Ecologies work, have really turned a Black expressive culture. I mean, of course, there's Woodson and there's Du Bois and there's all kinds of other Black writers who we can, up through June Jordan and all those folks who we can take as textual in terms of environmental thought. And so I don't want to suggest that Black folks don't have any environmental thinkers that are formally intellectual, because there are plenty. M. Jackie Alexander, all kinds of Black feminist folks. But there is generally, you know, Black archives are defined by their ephemerality, their disposability. I mean, I just think about Zora Neale Hurston, a primary progenitor of Black ecological thought and praxis in terms of anthropological work, who, you know, if you go to University of Florida and talk to them about a small archival collection they have of hers, somebody had to rescue it from being burned, right? Or if we think about the Mississippi, you know, the Gulf Coast, I mean, you know, we're talking lots of multiple floods. You know, it's not just the current hurricanes, but the 27 flood, and more so than just that, the kind of you know, the riff on Christina Sharp, the kind of perpetual climate of anti-Blackness in this country, you know, creating the conditions of always displacement and disposability that makes Black archives a miracle, right? And 9/10 of Black material or material, written material, textual material that contains Black life is ledgers, you know, is slave ledgers, is incarceration records, is arrest records. And so, and I feel this acutely, my partner is currently working on a major exhibition at the African American Museum in Philadelphia on Anna Russell Jones. You know, this woman who, you know, has at least 7 or 8 addresses as a Black working class artist, has at least 7 or 8 addresses in that archive. The fact that she holds onto all these materials and that there's even a kind of archive to reference is a miracle, right? That's, you know, that's quite distinct from anyone who can hold on to their place of housing as in a permanent sense. And we're, you know, in the context of Philly or New Orleans, we always talking about perpetual devastation through house fires, floods, collapsing houses, all of that. So anyway, I just wanted to say, yeah, I think, again, Barrett and Barrett's work around this, the border between singing and signing is significant there. I think if you don't deal with Black intertextuality as a multimodal, a sonic, a visual, and other kind of set of archives, then you can't get at the kind of you can't get at Black archives.
Thanks, everyone. Marcy, go ahead.
Thanks. Thank you all for these fascinating talks. My question is for Iris, and your provocative and persuasive reading of this image makes me wonder if you think we need to revise our understanding of the relationship between the textual and pictorial sections of the Florentine Codex, and what your reflections are about that.
That's a great question. Certainly working on the hummingbird and tracing the story of how the representation of Huitzilopochtli in particular changed from the Primeros Memoriales stage in the 1550s to the Codex has made me think that even though we know that in the Codex, in the last version, the images were produced last, at least that is what we think so far collectively, those people might be following the cues of Primeros Memoriales in many ways. I mean, the codification of the images is at least 20 years old. They are remaking them, but preserving what the images of Memoriales do. So yes, I think we need to probably think of the images as the first form of discourse to analyze when it connects to the earliest stages as we know them, and then look at how the text is being incorporated into that framework. In my own case, I'm really struck by how different generations who are, thinking so differently. We know that the colegiales, the trilingual scholars who are working with Sahagún, they are fully Christianized, they are fully acculturated, they know Latin, they know rhetoric. But the fact that they are using Pliny in this way suggests to me that even though they are, I think, fully aware of what the purpose of producing this encyclopedia is, which is aiding evangelization, they still find there is something worth preserving and encoding. I'm really fascinated by that. And I think there is not such a stark break between generations. I mean, they are fully Christianized by then, these intellectuals, but at the same time, they insert this knowledge there in a way that is not discovered or censored. So what do we do with that? Yeah, I think there is a ton of work to do.
There's a earlier comment from Lynn Farrington in the chat about how the view of paper and books as garbage can be transformed over time, since we frequently find our only evidence for, as she says, medieval manuscripts that are in the bindings of books. Just yesterday, someone posted on Twitter a unique title page of a unknown 16th century book that was found in the binding of another book. And this, one of the things that Stephanie and Matt, your talks made me think about on this question of paper and recycling and upcycling is that, we don't really use paper anymore, like again, whereas in the 1500s, 1600s, there's endless comments about how books, usually satirical comments about how books will end up in the outhouse or wrapping fish. Even in the 1990s, when you got fish and chips, it would sometimes come in old newspapers, but there's no way that you're going to get old newspaper wrapping your fish and chips today. It's going to be a new sheet of brown, butcher's paper or something. So I was thinking about the DIY project, Stephanie, that you were talking about. It's never really about using the paper. It's about like making a sculptural object. It's always a kind of, it's built on a kind of dramatic irony of the gap between the book and the new object. But we never really think about books as paper that can be used as paper very much. We don't write in them unless we're commenting on them. We don't just write something else typically in them anymore. So anyway, that I was just thinking about that and wondering if you had any thoughts about, you know, what that transformation in our like at certain times we seem to see the paper in books, and at other times we don't see the paper in books.
Yeah, I mean, my sense is that we're becoming a little bit perhaps more sensitized to paper and the materiality of books than, you know, perhaps we were in that sort of slightly earlier moment I was talking about, sort of the early and mid-aughts when all of the discourse was about e-reading and screens. And I think partly through the kinds of logics of global supply chains, as well as things like, you know, recycling, upcycling, downcycling, there's more awareness of not just materiality, but of materials. And so, you know, you see this in Amazon reviews where people, you know, what publishers dread when somebody 1 stars a book because the recipient didn't approve of the paper stock, right? And there the 1-star rating sits. So, yeah, I think part of also the larger agenda behind my talk too was to really sort of suggest a question of scale when we think about materiality, and the way in which, on the one hand, we can go very big in the ways that, for example, Stephanie was talking about, and sort of global, you know, kind of global sort of data slice, if you will, of reuse, recycling, how much is going into the landfill, but then also go very, very tiny and really look at transformations that are happening sort of quite literally on the molecular scale in terms of how very familiar objects are now made, and then think about that for the future implications of our own work.
I mean,
Peter, did you want to comment on that? Go ahead, Stephanie. Sorry, go ahead, Stephanie.
I mean, I haven't, I know what you're talking about. There's a sort of different, you know, the life of the book right now is just really different, right? It is not this magisterial thing that you have in your house, and you either have to protect it or preserve it, or there is still a shocking amount of paper being used, though. We think we're living in a world that doesn't use much paper. There's an unbelievable amount of paper being used, in the paper market, you know, it goes up and down every week. You have to track like who's buying paper. And, you know, it sort of kills me a little bit that if I do decide to de-accession all my books and put them in the dumpster, I will get them back in the form of toilet paper. Like, we are just doing the same sort of thing that was done. We've just put a giant pulping and recycling industry between us and the outhouse. So
I want to just share this real quick, just to highlight it in the background for context. In the background, if you can see those smokestacks, I'm pretty sure they are they're a paper mill, right? I just wanted to highlight that. And also to draw into this discussion, Danielle Purifoy's excellent work about rural Eastern North Carolina and paper and wood production in that context of you know, ongoing extraction in relation to former plantation, you know, North Carolina, the Eastern Black Belt, and Eastern Virginia, very similar. You know, literally, you know, this kind of landscape that I grew up imagining as a kind of greenscape and left. You know, I luckily had, in graduate school, Elizabeth Blackmore, who disabused me of any notion that the landscape was just a pristine one. But it, you know, it took me a minute in a kind of cultural unlearning to see the kind of ways that tree plantations are everyday part of how Virginia is, how it works. And even, even down to the level of extraction and its relationship to accidents and all of these kinds of things. Like these roads are built for logging and that's it, right? That has real effects on Black life. So I'll hush now, but I just wanted to show that in the background that since we're talking paper and where it's produced, let's talk about where paper is produced.
No, I
Yeah,
totally
go ahead, Peter.
totally agree. And the same is true in New England, right? Where everyone is thinking like, oh, go to Maine. It's the most beautiful place in the world. But it's just been this like, the rivers are polluted, people's lungs are damaged, the paper plants that still exist there now, Scott Paper is now owned by Huhtamaki, employ and poison the same group of people all at once, right? Like this is how you get your employment. This is how you're going to be slowly poisoned by the conditions of life under capitalism that are making paper that is mostly used by students or offices that you're not going to have access to. So I totally agree that the whole cycle of it, beginning and ending, is really critical.
Well, we're coming up on 7, so I think Peter, why don't you?
No,
ask the last
John
question or
had
make
a
the
question. John's had his question.
But John just texted me to let you have the last question, so you guys can fight it out.
Okay.
All right.
So I've already had
Well,
my
all right. I'll go ahead. I haven't.
go.
And then Peter, we'll sneak us both in. Okay. Great stuff, everybody. Thank you so much. There's so much to say, and I was stumbling through trying to put something together on water for all of you, but it didn't work out. So I just want to say something that maybe we could all think about, and Zach too. I feel like there's a narrative of so-called book history going back to the invention of the discipline, which is about this preservation loss problem and the sort of, the recovery, the listing, the bibliographical act of documenting disappearing things, and also imagining things that we have lost and that we can't recover, and that there's some interesting thread in sort of book history from its inception about that. And I feel like all of your talks in some ways revolve around this problematic dynamic of preservation and loss, and it's just something I'm thinking about and taking us, of course, to very different ways of having us think about that. I mean, Matt does it in the digital realm. I mean, JT's taking us to the problem of folk and the folk, and of course, Edith's important work on what loss meant in the colonial world. I just feel like there's a book history theme there about the origins of that discipline that is somehow part of this.
Could I just
yeah, go ahead, Peter.
Just piggyback on that, which is really just saying the same thing. But Dan Traister, this great Philadelphia Penn rare book librarian, would begin his course by tearing up a book in front of his students. He'd actually begin his course that way, and it was to sort of get at, the vast majority of libraries. The whole point is we have these pieties about the book. The actual reality is that Penn is disposing of books all the time. Every library is disposing of books. You're making new shelf space. You can't do otherwise. You literally have to, there's this sort of fantasy you're going to store everything off site, and it doesn't happen. Basically, stuff is going to get, and so the history of the world is that. So one of the questions in that Arthur Keron put is that the Geniza, all these fragments we have, they were dumps. That's why we have all this material, is because they were dumps. So paradoxically, the dumps have preserved all these fragments from antiquity that actually weren't preserved in libraries. The Alexandria, literally disappeared. So all these libraries failed in many ways. But the other thing I just want to say is that recycling is the condition for just about everything. The recycling is the historical condition for, and that's what, of course, the rag paper until the 19th century, the poorest people in Europe were rag pickers. They were the poorest people. They were massively illiterate. They were living below the poverty line. But what they did is to gather rags to make paper out of it. And so then, of course, we get wood pulp and so on. So actually, paradoxically, books are involved with everybody's lives, but often the poorest of the poor. And so we're sort of thinking that whole history of recycling that's always going to be there. And the notion of preservation is always going to be this tiny little thing, which is important, really important, because it depends whose history gets preserved, which histories get preserved. And that's why it becomes, endlessly political, endlessly, important in all the ways that you've also brilliantly shown in your wonderful presentation. So just thank you for a fabulous series of presentations. They were really wonderful, a wonderful evening.
Well, I think I will piggyback on that to invite us all to thank all our panelists. Thank you, JT, Matt, Stephanie, and Iris for 4 great talks. Do come back next week for our last seminar of the semester, Roger Chartier, and we will see you in some form next year too, I hope. Thank you, everyone.